So how do you handle depression without a therapist? How do you handle the fear of old age or the issues that come with poverty or the loneliness that comes with the superficial side of life, of accumulation and things? Or this sense that you're not connected to others in relationship, that people can't relate to you and can't understand you. One of the things that I feel might be helpful is to have a quick look at Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti. He was my mentor's teacher. Helen Schuckman and her friendship with Bill Thetford. She was the psychotherapist, the clinical psychologist that wrote The Course in Miracles. And then Ramana. Now, Krishnamurti set up a set of schools, and the focus of those schools was to focus on an educated mind, an education that brought one to the end of sorrow, which is a beautiful focus of education. Mostly education is about fitting into a rather sick world. Now, he encouraged excellence in studies and in subjects and in sports, but by and large, competition in sports wasn't allowed in schools. Like the focus was on cooperation, and he wanted to create a different kind of mind. And a friend of mine works at one of the Krishnamurti Foundation schools, and actually at the foundation, and he gave me the sense, like all phenomenal things, that probably the Krishnamurti schools will fall apart. They will drop away in time. And then there was Ramana, who just became spontaneously enlightened. And I studied in India for a decade. I studied the Yoga Sutras, which is a map of the mind and where liberation lies, having studied for a decade the Course in Miracles. And so I had these three primary influences: Krishnamurti, the Course in Miracles as taught by Tara Singh and to an extent Ken Wapnick, and then Ramana Maharshi. And when you're interested in the psychotherapeutic approach, you look into people like Carl Jung and Carl Rogers and these characters. But I was really taken by the passion and I grew up in a very adventurous family, so I had a sense of, Indonesian batik and the culture behind that. I had a sense of the Norse myths and the Greek myths and the Arthurian myths, and of course the Christ myth and the Buddhist culture, and Native American culture. Went to see Hiawatha as a musical. And so I was very much not raised in a Christian culture in my family, and I was very much not raised in church. I think we went to Sunday school as children a little bit, but we never went to church. And I think the school that I studied at was associated with an Anglican church, and we would go for services there. But because it wasn't in the culture of my family, it just didn't exist. I think it's interesting to look at this problem of depression, the problem of negative thinking, the problem of the positive mindset that denies negative thinking, and education in general, because education in general is really about making a home in this world, and that's perfectly sane. You have to take care of your body's needs. But the drudgery of work, the callousness of other humans, the pain body that we have carrying around in our minds, all of these present tremendous resistances to going beyond depression, going beyond psychological pain. And I spent a lot of time alone in the last few years, and often in nature. And solitude is a beautiful thing. Like, you never have an argument with yourself, but the only thing, I don't, but the only thing that I find is sometimes the mind slumps and it goes into this dark place, and things can seem quite futile. But these three avenues that sort of met in my life one was like, wow, there's this incredible gift that's come almost in spite of itself out of the academic world, called the Course in Miracles. But it's in a Christian language, and for years I had a real challenge with that. But without doubt, like, the metaphysics in the Course in Miracles is the most advanced that I've come across. Just in it's kind of it's a very large book, but the conciseness of it. In terms of it's like, there was a tiny mad idea that led to the whole universe as we know it, and what appeared like almost endless beauty and awesomeness and almost endless suffering. So that was like my one foot in the door, apart from my interest in physics and aspects of biology and medicine and mathematics in general. That was my one foot into the door of the academic world that I thought, wow, there's something that comes from this that is all-encompassing. And then Krishnamurti, you can tell when you sort of look at the lives of Krishnamurti and Ramana that both of them were speaking from pretty much the same place. But Krishnamurti was very much a man of the world, and his destiny was to sort of go around and talk to people within the modern story and be very practical. And we have people like Richard Feynman, the great physicist, for dinner in California, and he said of him, he's a brilliant man, but his cleverness can't see what is right in front of his eyes. And he had, he knew Harvey Keitel, the great actor. He was friends with aristocrats, and he studied yoga in India with Desikachar and Krishnamacharya. But his state of being really didn't need yoga. It was just to keep his body healthy. He was already there. And the thing with Ramana was, he just lay down, and like a surgeon cuts through a horrible tumor, he just cut out at source every lie about himself in an instant, really. He just said, something's going to die, and he realized what dies doesn't have any relationship with who he is or who we are. And these are just stories, that you're facing like a lot of depression maybe in your life. You're facing the weight of relationships where people just don't get what you're talking about. They don't have any compassion or empathy, as it seems, for your struggles. And And then you go to a therapist and you might find them quite patronizing, or they're expensive. And you just come away with a state of disillusionment, or you don't, and you just you think it's all a bunch of nonsense. And often a lot of therapists make the problem worse than it is. But I would say, the first thing you have to be open to is that there's a different thought system. And that thought system is available to you, much like a radio antenna can pick up on different signals to play different radio stations. And the sort of default radio station in your head is the ego. And the ego's thought system is, I'm separate from the whole. I have a beginning, a middle, and end. When I'm threatened, I need a scapegoat to support my upset and to justify it. And that scapegoat could be me, or it could be me pushed out onto another. And I think what begins to happen when the mind is ripe for change, some set of experiences, usually or often painful, support a questioning of what's this all about? Why am I here? But what all of those teachings that I've mentioned, well, from Carl Rogers to Carl Jung to Helen Schucman's Course in Miracles to Ramana or Krishnamurti, they all say there's a self-concept, an image maker in the mind. And this image maker is what gets hurt. Krishnamurti said, do you know what the secret of my peace is? I don't mind what happens. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't have preferences. What it kind of begins to reflect back to us is the fact that there's a level of causation, there's a level behind appearances where we have an identity that doesn't change, that transcends the world of form. And at the essence of our nature, when the mind becomes very quiet and we're very focused on living a peaceful life, we become aware, increasingly aware, that beyond the self-concept, beyond the ups and downs of the mind, our being is rooted in happiness. And I have a friend whose mother just died, and he was very close to her. He was the most important person in his life in a way. And I just said to him, I can't offer anything helpful, because I've been in places like that where something horrible happens from your level of experience as you are. And you just have to go through it. It's like a canoe. You lose your oar on a river and you're going downstream, and you just have to sit in the canoe and wait till it gets to a part of the river where you can jump out and be back in civilization. But without the oar, it's like you're rudderless. You're just taken down by the grief and the pain or the anger or the upset. But what Krishnamurti said was just watch that process and become aware that the observer is the observed. So what he meant was all your projections, all your separate ideas about your nature was strung up in this self-concept. And that self-concept was projecting all these feelings into reality that betrayed and stole you away from this happiness of being. And what I've noticed is that, like, no matter what the thinking mind does, no matter what the pressures of the world do, this underlying awareness that there's something that isn't based on becoming, right? Because we have to constantly become in the world. We have to find the right job, we have to find the right rent, we have to find the right situation to survive in the body and to get our needs met, and sometimes our wants, which go beyond our needs, and we can get lost in those. But after, like the Course in Miracles says, that, you can only take, there's a sort of finite amount of pain that you can submit to, and once you've reached the limits of that, it's not like the suicide or you die or whatever, but there's a sense where that drops away, and the pain mechanism in the mind, which is so bound to this runaway train, this seemingly endlessly moving momentum of problems and attachment to the problems and self-pity and projection of aggression and projection of undermining the value of others or self, something starts to fall away. And then I think a sort of quietude, which is separate from the observer as the observed, starts to blossom. And in my personal life, like, I was going to go to university and so forth, but then I had all these inner guidances, which were immensely challenging because they're not something you learn about in school, that sort of led me intuitively to go to India and study yoga. But it really was when I met Tara Singh, I had the sense that there was a sense in us that there was something beyond life and death, the body and the mind. And that was just too important to me to walk away from, because, like, there's a Tamil saying that the mind is the most cruel master, or in the hands of someone who is intent on excavating the wisdom behind the statement, "I'm not a victim of the world I see." That kind of mind, that mind that's liberated of the ego thought system, is a very obedient and loving servant. And when you're dealing with depression and you're not interested in having a therapist, or you can't, or you find them all a bit stuck up their ass with, looking for the light, and often many of them are, and I mean that. It's like they get lost in all these academic theories, and they just say it's all about the heart. They pander to these cliches, and ultimately you're in the labyrinth of your inner story, and you have to take up the mantle of that inner teacher that guides you to this place inside where you can use the mind as a faithful servant to handle whatever thought. And you have to look at all the thoughts and say, what's behind this thought? And if it's a victim thought or a victimizing thought, if it's an attack thought or a defense thought, somehow you have to filter, you have to see what you have to filter to drop away this identity, this self-concept. And I would say in that sense that all of these advanced approaches to the spiritual focus are about calming the mind. And one of the things that I found after studying yoga for a long time was, like, I'm not against yoga. I think it can be a very nice healing balm for many people, and it's a good practice for the body. It does help the mind calm down. But in the end, I just thought, well, I want to be constantly attentive. I don't want to be lost in the idea I've got to get somewhere. I want to be looking at the mind and practicing this meditative practice without any fluff. And for me, like Ramana's question, who am I? And the Course in Miracles, just its, statements in the workbook, they became indelibly the first line of the lesson, those lines just became indelibly framed into my mind. And so what would happen is I'd study that stuff alone mostly, but with teachers as well. But in the end, you're only there with yourself and looking in the mirror of self. But I would, over time, having meditated deeply on these things, more and more, though on the outside my world was often quite chaotic, this rising deep emotional intelligence could see through the fluff of others and self, and just there was this sort of quietude that hasn't gone away. It's intensified. It doesn't mean there aren't horrible clouds of depression that come now and again, and sadness at the stories of the world. There's a sort of, as opposed to the title of the novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, there's a bearable lightness of being that starts to levitate inside you and become more real than the outer world. And I think my parents were quite disappointed that I didn't become a zoologist and so forth, because that was my passion, and I love the natural world. But one of the things that you get from studying evolution is, well, where's it leading? And the biologists will say we don't know and so forth. But then Krishnamurti said, if the mind is very quiet, then you can jump the million years to the next stage in evolution. And I think that is just like, that was his way of saying what we're talking about here is real. It's not imagined. There is a state that all of nature is moving towards, and it's an enlightened state, and that's the state that is not manufacturing sorrow, because the pain mechanism, the self-concept that needs that center to generate its self-pity and its victimhood and to project victimhood onto others, has just come to a grinding halt.